Section 9 of Lectures to Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lectures to Young People by William B. Sprague. Regard to the favor of the world, contrasted with regard to the favor of God. Part 1. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. Not as pleasing men, but God. The church to which this epistle was addressed is supposed to have been planted by Paul and Silas soon after the outrages committed upon them at Philippi, and recorded in the 16th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. In the verses immediately preceding the text, the apostle alludes to the signal success which attended his first labors among the Thessalonians, and notices, as an occasion of rejoicing, the fact that he and his companion in labor, notwithstanding the shameful treatment they had just met in a neighboring city, and the obstacles which they still had to encounter, were enabled, in the strength of divine grace, to preach the gospel with boldness and fidelity. And what chiefly encouraged them to these courageous efforts was the reflection that they had no mercenary purposes to answer, that there was nothing in their management in respect to which they need shrink from the strictest scrutiny, but all was open and honest, not as pleasing men, or as consulting the tastes and prejudices of the world, but as endeavoring to secure the approbation of God, which trieth our hearts. The text, you will perceive, has a primary reference to ministers of the gospel, and surely if there be a class of men in respect to whom it is preeminently important that they should act under the influence of the principle which the apostle here recognizes, ministers of the gospel constitute that class. But it is important that all others should be governed by this principle, as well as ministers. It is especially important that its influence should be felt by persons in the morning of life, because that is the period in which habits are formed, which, in most cases, constitute the elements of future character. When the apostle, in our text, institutes an apparent opposition between pleasing men and pleasing God, we are not to suppose that he intends to forbid every effort to please men, for this would be inconsistent not only with many of his exhortations, but with his own conduct. Let every one of us, saith he, please his neighbor for his good to edification. And again, I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. The gospel not only allows but requires that we should seek the favorable regards of our fellow men, especially as means of our own usefulness, and the course of conduct which it prescribes is exactly fitted to such a result. Hence it has been said, with much truth and force, that the gospel contains the most perfect system of politeness which the world has seen. The apostle, in our text, intends only to contrast a supreme regard to the approbation of the world and a supreme regard to the approbation of God as governing principles of action, and to imply that they are perfectly incompatible with each other. My purpose in this discourse is to illustrate and contrast the influence of these two dispositions, 1 upon human character, 2 upon human happiness. 1 upon human character. First, I remark in the first place that it is the tendency of a supreme regard to the approbation of the world to produce a fickle character, of a supreme regard to the approbation of God, a stable one. Who that has any knowledge of the world needs to be told that its maxims, principles, conduct are constantly changing? What at one period is admired as elegant or praiseworthy soon comes to be regarded with indifference, and perhaps ultimately sinks into contempt. And on the other hand, what at one time is considered mean or worthless gradually rises into respectability, and it may be at length becomes an object of admiration. For a complete illustration of this remark, you need only look into the walks of what is commonly called fashionable life, and you will see one fashion after another, in respect to manners, dress, equipage, and many other things, succeeding so rapidly that even the devotees of fashion themselves are scarcely able to do homage to every new idol. Here you have a fair specimen of the fluctuation of human opinion. If then you make human opinion the standard of your conduct, and that standard is constantly varying, your conduct must, of course, exhibit a corresponding course of changes. And here is the foundation of a fickle character. On the other hand, the person who seeks supremely the approbation of God has a fixed standard of action. The law of God is his rule of duty, and that law, like its author, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He may indeed sometimes be embarrassed, in respect to particular cases, to know what this law requires and what it forbids, but in general it marks out for him a plain path. Hence, he acts not only in conformity to a fixed standard, but generally without hesitation, and in this way he cannot fail to acquire and to exhibit stability of character. Second, it is the tendency of a supreme regard to the approbation of the world to produce a timid character, of a supreme regard to the approbation of God, a courageous one. The devotee of the world's favor has no easy task to perform. He well knows that he must shape his conduct to suit different and opposite dispositions, that in securing the approbation of one, he is liable to lose that of another, and that the means which may seem to him best adapted to gain favor may prove to be fraught with injury or disgrace. Besides, he has, sometimes at least, a secret conviction that the course which he is pursuing is wrong, and that his Maker and Judge is offended that the supreme homage of his heart should be withheld from him. Here then is a double influence exerted to produce a timid character. On one hand, he fears that he shall not gain the object which he is seeking. On the other, he fears that if he does gain it, it will be at the expense of what is infinitely more valuable. Is it not obvious that a character formed under such an influence will be likely to bear a strong impression of timidity? But in seeking supremely the favor of God, there is everything to inspire true courage. There is the certainty of success, which is always favorable to bold and vigorous action. There is the reflection that he whose approbation we seek is all gracious and almighty, and that let the world do by us as it may, his favor is a sufficient portion. There is, moreover, the consideration that the course which we are pursuing is in itself the right course, the course which reason, conscience, the Bible, all prescribe. Who that acts under the influence of considerations like these can fail to act with unyielding resolution? Third, it is the tendency of a supreme regard to the approbation of the world to produce a hypocritical character, of a supreme regard to the approbation of God, an honest one. I have already remarked that, owing to the different tastes and dispositions of men, it will often happen that that course of conduct which will gain the approbation of one will forfeit that of another, and hence he whose governing object is to please the world will endeavor to appear to each one in such a character as he supposes will be most likely to secure regard, and to conceal from each one whatever he thinks will serve to excite displeasure. If he happens to fall in with one who is a warm advocate of any particular measure, the desire of popularity will naturally lead him to appear as an advocate of it also. Or if he happens to be in the company of another by whom the same measure is opposed, the same desire will operate to induce him, if not to join in opposition to the measure, at least to say nothing in its favor. In this way, he contracts the habit of dissimulation, and his whole intercourse becomes a system of studied concealment. But on the other hand, he who is governed by a supreme regard to the favor of God has no motive to depart from the path of open and honest dealing. If he were to do this, he would instantly defeat his object. For not the approbation, but the frown of Jehovah attends all insincerity. Moreover, the course which he is pursuing neither involves guilt nor awakens shame. There is, therefore, no reason why he should attempt to conceal his conduct from his fellow men, or why he should desire to conceal it from his Maker. Hence his character bears upon it the impression of truth and honesty. Fourth, it is the tendency of a supreme regard to the approbation of the world to produce an inconsistent character, of a supreme regard to the approbation of God, a consistent one. As he who is governed by a supreme regard to the favor of the world has no fixed rule of action, but is blown hither and thither by the breath of popular opinion, the different parts of his conduct must, of course, be inconsistent with each other. As the opinions of different individuals whom he wishes to please are at variance, there must be a corresponding variance between the course of conduct which he adopts in different cases, in order to gain his object, and hence his life is a perpetual scene of contradictions. And if he happens to be a professor of religion, he is chargeable with double inconsistency. For not only are the different parts of his conduct inconsistent with each other, but his deportment as a whole is utterly inconsistent with his profession. For in his profession is implied an engagement to make the will of God, and not the opinions of men, the rule of his conduct. Most of the inconsistency that attaches itself to the characters of professed Christians, and I may add, of all others, results no doubt from an improper desire to please the world. But he who acts from a supreme regard to the approbation of God cannot fail to exhibit a consistent character. The rule by which his conduct is governed requires that every duty should be done in its proper place, and in adhering to this, his character, in its different parts, acquires a beautiful consistency and harmony, which it could acquire under no other influence. Such a person will not, on the one hand, neglect his retired duties, the duties of secret prayer, and reading of the Scriptures, and self-communion, for the sake of being constantly engaged in public religious exercises. Nor, on the other hand, will he excuse himself from the more public services of religion, on the ground that he is regular in the duties of the closet. He will not substitute works for faith, nor faith for works, but will exhibit both in bright and beautiful combination. He whose favor he seeks requires that he should cultivate all the virtues and graces of the Christian, and if he fail in respect to any, he so far incurs the divine displeasure. Hence his character is consistent with itself, and if he be a professed follower of Christ, it is consistent with his profession. Once more, it is the tendency of a supreme regard to the approbation of the world to produce an unholy character, of a supreme regard to the approbation of God, a holy one. It is the decision of inspiration that the whole world lieth in wickedness, and what the Bible teaches on this subject, observation abundantly confirms. It is only necessary to look abroad into the world to be satisfied that the maxims, the feelings, the practices that generally prevailed in it are directly opposite to the spiritual and holy requisitions of God's work. He, therefore, who makes the approbation of the world his supreme object, must expect that his character will, in this respect also, take the stamp of the mold in which it is cast. Moreover, the very object which he is seeking, considered as a supreme object, is unholy. The means by which he endeavors to gain it are also unholy. And under such an influence, how can he form any other than an unholy character? It were a contradiction to suppose that a person should make the favor of the world his governing object, and not retain that carnal mind which is enmity against God. He, on the other hand, who seeks supremely the approbation of God, endeavors to be conformed to a standard of perfect holiness. He can gain the divine approbation only by yielding to the law which God has given him as the rule of his conduct, and that law is perfectly holy. In endeavoring to obey its requisitions, he comes under a sanctifying influence. He is brought immediately into the atmosphere of moral purity, and the more earnestly he seeks the divine approbation, by seeking conformity to the divine law, the more his character becomes assimilated to that of the infinitely holy God. Second, such is the influence which the two principles brought to view in our text exert upon human character. I am now, secondly, to illustrate the influence of the same principles on human happiness. And if the effect on character be as has been represented, it would seem that little need be said to illustrate the effect on happiness, for it admits of no question, on the one hand, that a stable, courageous, honest, consistent, and holy character is favorable to happiness, nor, on the other, that a fickle, timid, hypocritical, inconsistent, and unholy character has within itself the elements of misery. But as this is a point of great importance, I shall illustrate it by several distinct particulars. 1. The person who seeks supremely the favor of the world has no assurance that he shall gain it. He who seeks supremely the favor of God has certain evidence that his efforts will be successful. In order to estimate the difficulty of gaining the favor of the world, consider for a moment how difficult it often is to gain the favor of an individual. Not infrequently the efforts to accomplish this object fail, from the want of a proper knowledge of the disposition to be consulted, or from their being made at an unpropitious moment, or from suspicion being excited that they have originated in some selfish purpose. Hence it has often happened that the very means which have been used to secure favor have resulted in producing displeasure or disgust. And if it is often so difficult to gain the favor even of an individual, how much greater the task to gain that of many, and how much greater still that of the world, or of that part of it with which we have intercourse. As the number of individuals, and of course the variety of dispositions which we have to consult in our conduct, increases, the greater the probability that interfering claims will be made upon us which we shall not be able to meet, and that in gaining the favor of some, we shall provoke the jealousy of others. Thus you perceive that if you make the approbation of the world your supreme object, you can never be certain of gaining it, at least in any considerable degree. Admitting that it were ever so valuable when attained, you may, for aught you can tell, spend your days in seeking it, and die without ever having gained your object. But he who seeks supremely the favor of God has an assurance that his efforts shall not be in vain. This assurance results from the declarations of God and from the experience of men. Jehovah, speaking under the name of wisdom, says, "I love them that love me, and they that seek me early shall find me." And again, our Savior says, "He that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me. And he that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and will manifest myself to him. And the testimony of experience corresponds with the declarations of God. Every person who has made the favor of God his supreme object has attained it, and in far the greater number of instances, the evidence of having attained it has been communicated in the light of God's countenance and in the spirit of adoption. Every such instance conveys an assurance that the favor of God may be gained by all who will seek it in a proper manner. Here, then, you perceive one important point of difference between the two objects brought to view in our text: the difference between a certainty and an uncertainty. Even if the favor of God and the favor of the world, when actually gained, were equally valuable as a means of promoting happiness, yet you have no security that you can gain the one, while you have certain evidence that you may gain the other. Who that is wise would choose to spend his strength in pursuit of that which would probably elude his grasp, while his efforts might be directed towards another object, to say the least of equal value, which was fairly within his reach? End of section 9.